This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. The premiere of Pyotr Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony in 1878 was the culmination of one of the most turbulent periods in his life. Tchaikovsky was by nature neurotic and depressive, a hypochondriac, a mostly closeted homosexual, and at times desperately insecure about his own talent. In 1877, he had impulsively married a young woman who had been his student, a move which almost cost him his sanity and his life. But during this time, he also managed to complete some of his greatest works, including the Fourth Symphony, his violin concerto, and the opera Evgeny Onegin, thanks to what was probably the most important relationship of his life with his friend, confidant, and patron, the Countess Nadezhda von Meck, a relationship carried on entirely through the mail. The Countess gave Tchaikovsky not just money, but confidence, artistically and personally, to confront his demons through his music. Tchaikovsky had told Madame von Meck that his Fourth Symphony followed the same narrative arc as Beethoven's Fifth, and he even used a similar fate knocking at the door motif throughout the work. But when it came time for Tchaikovsky to write his own Fifth Symphony 10 years later, there were clearly still foes to be vanquished. He went back to Beethoven's Fifth, the original Victory Symphony, for his model. Tchaikovsky spent the summer of 1888 at a vacation home he had built not far from Moscow. He arrived there on May 21st and immediately began working on two pieces at once, the Fifth Symphony and the symphonic poem Hamlet. In a letter to his brother Modeste, he expressed his reservations that he still had enough inspiration. He feared that his imagination had dried up, that he had nothing more to express in music. But still, he saw a glimmer of hope. I am hoping to collect, little by little, material for a symphony. In June, he wrote to Madame von Meck, I am exceedingly anxious to prove to myself, as to others, that I am not played out as a composer. Have I told you that I intend to write a symphony? The beginning was difficult, but now inspiration seems to have come. We shall see." End quote. Soon, he set aside Hamlet, and it took him only 4 weeks to sketch out the symphony. By August, it was done. The seeds of the symphony, though, had been planted in April, when Tchaikovsky wrote in his notebook, Introduction, Complete Resignation Before Fate, or what is the same thing, The Inscrutable Designs of Providence. Allegro 1, Murmurs of Doubt, Laments, Reproaches Against... XXX. 2, Shall I Cast Myself in the Embraces of Faith? 3 question marks. A wonderful program, if only it can be carried out. XXX. To this day, nobody knows what Tchaikovsky meant. Some musicologists maintain that it refers to his homosexuality, others to his gambling addiction. Whatever it stood for, it was obviously something the composer considered secret and personal. Whatever it is, we have no doubt that this symphony is about something, even though Tchaikovsky himself later protested that the symphony in the end had no program whatsoever. Just as Berlioz had used a particular phrase which he called an idée fixe to represent his beloved in the Symphonie Fantastique, Tchaikovsky's opening phrase portrays the inevitability of fate, or whatever those 3 X's represented. The phrase recurs throughout the symphony, and the changes it goes through mark the symphony's path from darkness to light. And yet, not everything in the opening is bleak. Shafts of sunlight often cut through the shadows, hopeful secondary melodies. Brightly sunny orchestrations and jaunty rhythms. Passages of balletic grace. And despite what seems to be a hopeful march to the end of the movement, it finally ends in the gloom in which it began. The slow movement qualifies as a musical icon. Even if you consider Tchaikovsky hopelessly sentimental, it's hard not to be moved by it. The opening theme emerges from the gloom to stand as a voice of consolation in the desolate wilderness. That solo horn passage eventually becomes a leisurely conversation with the other solo winds. And eventually gives way to the passionate second theme for the strings. It's no wonder this movement has been adapted by generations of songwriters, from Glenn Miller to John Denver to Eric Carmen. And then suddenly, this tranquil mood is brutally interrupted by the Fate theme, played in the brass. The rest of the orchestra seems shocked and holds its breath. Before picking up the pieces of the melody, one section at a time. Tchaikovsky was a master of the symphonic waltz, and he uses one of his most graceful creations to lighten the mood in the third movement. Tchaikovsky said this melody came from a song he had heard sung by a young boy in Florence some years earlier. The almost fairy tale quality of this music is reminiscent of Tchaikovsky's ballet scores like Swan Lake, The Sleeping Beauty, and The Nutcracker. But fate is still lurking. The symphony's final movement at least suggests that triumph is a possibility, although with Tchaikovsky one can never be too sure. The Fate theme, which has just closed the third movement, opens the finale, but now it is transformed from E minor to a more hopeful E major. Whenever he can, Tchaikovsky takes the opportunity to banish the shadows that have haunted the symphony. Much as Beethoven did in his Fifth and Ninth Symphonies. But in the end, Tchaikovsky's is a different story. Soon after the piece's premiere, one commentator wrote, "If Beethoven's Fifth is fate knocking at the door, Tchaikovsky's Fifth is fate trying to get out." And it nearly does so, after a journey that threatens to culminate in a series of climactic B major chords. But it's not over yet. The adventure continues to a conclusion that is, to some extent, ambiguous. Four closing chords that we may hear as triumphant, but may just as easily sound ominous. They are, after all, in the same rhythm as the opening of Beethoven's Fifth. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.